Morning all, it's Clive. Welcome to the Mitchell Brewery. It's time for another brew day. I've got the boiler on. Let's get cracking. I'm making an IPA today and all my ingredients are in the corner there and I'll just run them through with you. Here we go. This is the trusty Mitchell Brewery notebook and you can see that I'm using a mix of Maris Otter, lager malt, crystal malt, Munich malt, rolled oats, Caramalt, Torrefied wheat, amber malt. I'm using East Kent Goldings at the start of the boil, Galaxy about an hour into the boil, and then at the end of the boil I'm using Nelson Sauvin. I'm going to dry hop with a Chinook hop tea bag and I'm using the M44 yeast. So here is my trusty boiler. Now I had a bit of an issue with this boiler last time and I thought it was a goner, and after a bit of surgery I've resurrected it. I've essentially bypassed the thermostat, so it won't cut out anymore. So hopefully all's well and it's on its way to 100 at the minute. So it's a lovely sunny day in Nottingham. I thought I'd give you a quick tour of the Mitchell Brewery. A friend of mine made this lovely sign for the brewery. Here we go, as you can see it's a shed and it's all set up with the boiler and my stand, etc. I've got all my hops ready here. My dad made me this lovely sign a while ago and the boiler is approaching 100, so we're not far off starting the next brew. As you can see I've got my fan on because if you don't, this place will soon fill up very quickly with condensation. You can already see the boiler dripping a little bit. I'm going to get this up to a nice rolling boil. Just take the lid off so we're not far off, and I'll show you in a minute, but basically this is just a giant jug kettle with an element at the bottom, so this takes about an hour and a half or so, yeah, about that, to get to 100 from well, actually I left the water in overnight, so it did warm up a little bit. It was about 18 degrees when it started. Normally it's about 8 degrees from the mains. This is the mash tun. Basically this is a converted cool box, so if we take the lid off, you'll see they've adapted it and they've added a pipe and it's sort of like, this is sort of metal gauze, and you fill this with grain. Let's let the grain soak in water that extracts the sugar from the grain. That sugary solution then goes through here, so this mesh is to filter off the malt. Basically you don't want that getting in, and then you just drain the sugary solution into a bucket like this. You can see my temperature probe basically is that. It's the sort of thing that you'd use for testing the temperature of a joint of beef when you're cooking on a Sunday maybe, so it's pretty handy actually. Here we go, that'll do. That's got to a nice rolling boil now. Here we go, this is Maris Otter Pale Malt. This is the main malt used in a lot of British beers, and it's barley which has been malted, and the white stuff is the sugar that's going to convert to alcohol. Next up is lager malt, and to be honest I don't look that much difference to Maris Otter. This is another pale malt, so hence the pale colour of lager. Crystal malt is next. This is a very different beast and it's much darker and it's got more of a sort of an acidic taste, but it certainly has a sharper taste to the beer. Gives a bit of background and character. So you can see the crystal is a lot darker than the lager and the Maris Otter. Next we have Munich Malt, and again this is another pale looking malt. Next up, rolled oats. Yes indeed, porridge oats. You can use porridge oats in your beer. I quite like using this because it gives what we call head retention, so you get a nice foamy head and it stays on your beer when you pour it. Next up we have the intriguingly named Torrefied wheat. Well, basically that just means subject to intense heat, so that's not really different from the other malts, to be honest. Caramalt is next, and this is a little bit like crystal. And finally a dash of amber malt. And there they all are, and I just need to get my trusty spoon and give them a good old mix up with some water. Go, this is the final addition of water. I need to give that a really good stir now, because you can hear air coming out of it. Well, I have to make sure that all of the grain is in contact with water. There are no dry patches at the bottom. You can see here I'm digging up dry patches now. So I'm going to do that and then seal it up because I don't want this to cool down too much. This is nicely mixed up now, so I'll just pop the lid on, seal it up. The mash tun is all sealed up and I've got my little extra cover. This will stay for an hour and a half. I've also popped the boiler back on and I will top this up with more water. So this needs to get up to the boil, cool down again, and that is the sparge water. This is the yeast I'm going to use today, M44 I referred to earlier. This is by Mangrove Jacks. It's a US West Coast yeast and you can see it's suitable for American style pales, IPAs, etc. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to rehydrate this and I'm going to use this half pint glass. I've got my thermometer there. Basically I've put boiling water in both of these because we have to be scrupulously clean at this stage because we don't want to get any infections into the yeast. So when this is all sterilised, I'm going to give it 10 minutes. I'm going to boil some water, add 110 mils into here, let it cool to less than 30 degrees C, otherwise the temperature of the water will kill the yeast, and then I will add the yeast and you'll see what happens later. Here we go, let me show you some hops now. Most hops used to be leaf hops, which was basically the hop cone dried and compressed and vacuum sealed. Nowadays we tend to get hops as pellets, and I'm not a great fan of these because basically these will just break right down and disintegrate into a fine sort of mush in the boiler. And with leaf hops that didn't happen, and it was easy to separate it from the beer. So what I have to do now is I have to use these sort of like muslin bags or this container here. So I've got one for each of the 3 hops that I'm going to use. So I'll add 30 grams into each, and say for example this would be the East Cape Goldens. This will be at the beginning of the boil, and that will then steep and it will because it's boiling, it will sterilise the container at the same time, so it's fine to add. This is the famous Nelson Sauvin from New Zealand. It's a pellet hop, and I'm going to add it into a bag and then add this in with the bitter wort later. This is one of my favourite parts, is unveiling the mash tun. So take the lid off. This has been steeping for an hour and a half. Oh, and you get the fantastic rush of malty, Ovaltine goodness surging out of the mash tun. That's fantastic. First thing to do is to drain off the first sort of flush of sugary solution, because this has probably got fine sediment in it. What I'll do is I'll drain this off and then pour it back in through the malt, which acts like a bit of a filter bed to capture those particles. So you can see that I refilled the boiler and set it to boil, so it got to 100 a while back, and I let it cool down to less than 80 again. And you can see here I've attached a bit of a plastic tube onto the tap, and at the end here you can see I've got the fine rose from a watering can, and I'll allow this to sprinkle over the water, to sprinkle over the malt, and that then washes the sugar out. This process is known as sparging. This is known as sweet wort. It's the sort of first surge of sugary solution from the mash tun, and it is full of sugar from the malt, and it's worth having a taste. That's about the sugariest thing you will taste. And that sugar in here will then be converted to alcohol by fermentation. Cheers. Okay, let's get on with the sparging. Turn it off. You can see you get a fine spray of water which I then play over the surface of the malt, and the idea is then that this will wash off all the sugar from the grain. This will take a little while. I won't film the whole thing, but the idea is to fill up this container and probably a bit more. While it's empty, let's have a quick look inside the boiler so you can see what I was talking about earlier. So it is basically just a big heating element. There's a filter there to stop any bits coming through the tap. Like I said, it's just a big jug kettle. Here we go, we have 20 litres here of sweet wort. There's a little bit extra there, but this is the first of it. I'm going to put this sweet wort into the boiler. I will then add the hops, and that converts the sweet wort to bitter wort, and then we're well on our way to making beer. So This is the sweet wort getting to a bit of a rolling boil, and I think it's going to overflow, so I might have to take some emergency measures in a minute to excavate some of this foam. No, stop! Okay, the sweet wort overflowed a little bit, as you can see, so I had to excavate. So I'm going to add the first hop addition, and this is the East Kent Golding, so I'll literally just pop that in there, and that'll be in there for the entire duration of the hop boil, which is an hour and a half. The hop boil, this is one of the favourite stages of the brewing process. This is when the brewery starts to smell like a proper brewery. You can see that that's the container for the first edition of the hops. We've got a nice boil going on, and we've got about another, I think, hour and 10 minutes. This is the copper chiller, which is going to go into the boiler, so once it's finished I've add this in to help cool the beer down to less than 30, so I'm going to pop it in a minute because it has to be sterilised. It needs to be sterilised by the boiling of the bitter wort. Last 15 minutes of the hop boil, I've still got one more hop addition to add, so that will go in as the boiler finishes, and that for the aroma, that's sort of the hops that if you have them too early, all this sort of essence, all the good stuff gets evaporated. So right to the end we'll add those. That's the end of the hop boil, so we'll add the hops, which is the Nelson Sauvin. We'll just steep in there. I'll turn on the chiller. So what happens with the heat exchanger, the water's coming in for this yellow one, and then going through here and then to the bottom of the coil, and then working its way up, and the heat exchanging, and then coming back to this one. You can feel how warm this one is actually cooling down again now. I just took my temperature probe just to measure the temperature of the shed. It's 30 degrees in here, so a little bit sweltering. So let's pop this back in here and see where we are in terms of temperature. Okay, right, it's good, we're down to 50 already. There you go, it's taken 15 minutes to up the temperature from boiling down to 30, so that's pretty good. So next I'm going to transfer it into this sterilised fermentation bin. Okay, right, let's transfer the bitter wort into the fermentation bin. There we go, I've got 20 litres of bitter wort. You can see that the yeast is nicely hydrated, so I'm going to pitch that into there and then leave it until next weekend. So it's going to be in there for about at least 5 or 6 days for the primary fermentation stage. Maybe after 3 or 4 days I'll add the hop tea bag for the dry hopping, and then the next stage you'll be taking it out of here and put it into bottles. Just taking the hydrometer reading, I'm getting 1.044, which equates to an alcohol content of 5.7%. Well, that's the original gravity, so we'll have to wait until we've done the fermentation before we can actually work out the actual alcohol content. That's looking good. This is a hop tea bag. I'm basically going to add this to some boiling water, leave it for 10 minutes, and the sort of hop tea I'm going to add into the primary fermentation bin. So this is the hop tea bag, pop that in there, and I've got some boiling water, add in, and just let that sit there for 10 minutes. It's a week later and the primary fermentation bin has done its stuff and it's finished. Have a quick look inside. You can see, here we go, this is the beer that's ready now to be decanted or siphoned off from here into the pressure barrel. About 3 days ago I popped in a hop tea bag, so that's been dry hopping inside here. That was a Chinook hop. I've added some finings. I'm also going to take a couple of samples so I can check the gravity before I add any additional sugar. And here's my trusty siphon, so let's get cracking. Here we go, so siphoning mid-flow, and you can see just at the bottom of the fermentation bin, you can see the end of the siphon. And I've taken off a couple of samples to check the gravity. So So this will take about 10-15 minutes to siphon through. Just taking the hydrometer reading, and we've got 1.007. That equates to an alcohol content at this stage after primary fermentation of 5%. So I'm safe now to add more sugar to the pressure barrel. I've weighed out 71 grams of just ordinary granulated sugar, and I shall dilute this with some of the beer from here and stick it in the top. The idea of adding extra sugar is to kickstart fermentation again for the second stage of fermentation. There we go, that's the sugar added, so I'll leave this for a couple of days and then I'm going to take it from here into bottles. It's a couple of days later. I've got 40 bottles all sterilised and washed out. I've got my bottling wand attached onto the pressure barrel, and I'm going to fill up these beauties with some beer. So the bottling wand is a very simple mechanism for filling up bottles. Make sure you loosen that, otherwise you create a bit of an airlock. And if you turn on the tap, what you should see is beer will come out and it'll just fill up the bottling wand. Crucially, it doesn't come out the bottom. So what you do, you can see there's a little point at the end. If I push this in, that gets depressed upwards and it releases the beer into the bottle. And hey presto, your bottle is filled with beer. You want it to fill to about here, not too much more than that. Leave an inch or so at the top, and that's called the ullage, to allow the beer to brew properly in the bottle. So if I do that, you can see that the volume of the bottling wand was about that. So that's about as much as I will fill the bottle up. So I'm going to crack on and fill up my bottle. There we go, 40 bottles filled, and I'm just going to pop the caps on and they'll go in a cupboard for 4 weeks to brew. There we go, all 40 bottles, all safely tucked away, and I'll be there for the next 4 weeks until September. That's the end of this video. Cheers everyone, happy brewing.